Alrighty, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to look at chapter 3. We're moving right along. We've done chapter 1 and 2 so far. So far we're just following the book. After chapter 3, we're going to skip a few chapters and go right into propositional logic uh, because it's just a very good segue to go from how to think about arguments, premises, conclusion, providing support, different types of arguments, and then going right into logic. Rather than the way the textbook has it, it takes a little detour into fallacies and a few other things, which we will return to. But I think there's a better flow. Logic will make more sense if we go right from arguments into logic. Okay, so that's my rationale for that. Apart from that, so far we've just been following the book, right? But then after this, we're going to jump right to the chapter on propositional logic. But for now, let's look at arguments in chapter 3. Some of this should be review, okay? Some of this we actually looked at mostly in chapter 1. Chapter 1 had a little bit to say about arguments because arguments are so central to critical thinking, right? It's really the core. What do you do as a critical thinker? You evaluate arguments, right? Sometimes that'll be a matter of assessing that somebody didn't provide an argument at all, right? That they used some sneaky technique, some sort of sneaky method to try to convince you that has nothing to do with reasons for belief. Right? Sometimes people don't use real arguments, they use irrelevant things. So sometimes that's what you're called upon to do as a critical thinker, right? Did this person actually provide an argument, right? But in those cases where they do provide an argument, then you have to be able to evaluate those, right? So hopefully you have a sense still of what an argument is, right? And hopefully you remember some of this stuff from chapter 1. So some of this should be review, okay? But if you don't totally remember, at least understand this: arguments are central to critical thinking, and knowing and understanding what arguments are is central to doing well in the class, right? So let us look some more at arguments. Right. So today we're just going to look at argument basics, and then later we'll look at the other ones. But for today, that's our plan. Argument basics. Some of this again is just review from things we already learned in chapter 1. Now, before I jump right into arguments, I just wanted to sort of frame it in this way and introduce it in this way. Uh, this dual process theory of persuasion comes to us from cognitive science, right? Which is kind of like, you can think of it as a branch of psychology that has to do with how we learn things, how we know things, and things like that, how we perceive things. It involves a lot, but there's this basic theory that human beings, we have two different techniques that we can try to use when we persuade other people, right? That's the dual process idea. Dual just means two, right? So there's two basic processes, two ways that as human beings we can try to persuade one another. The first one is the good kind, okay? That's the best way to say it, I think. This is how we ought to approach things, right? Central route persuasion means you try to get people to reach a conclusion, right, by having them think logically about the available evidence, right? So say I want to convince you of something. There's two ways that I can do it. This one right here is simply, hey, you, here's what I think is true. And here are my reasons for that. Here's my evidence. Here's my argument, right? That's what an argument is when you provide a stance on something, right? You have a main claim, and then you support it with premises. You support it with other statements, right? That's central route persuasion. That's the rational way to do it, right? Because then we can all get around. We can, we can make it into a thing. We can all get together and sit around and evaluate the argument together, right? Is that evidence actually true? Do we know that this evidence is correct? How likely is it that this evidence is true, etc.? And then, does the evidence actually support this main conclusion? Does it actually support your stance? And there's all sorts of objective standards that we can use to assess those questions, right? To be able to ask those questions and answer them. Right? So central route persuasion is That's the golden standard for persuasion. That's how we ought to persuade one another, through reasons, through being able to show that this thing is true or likely to be true by providing reasons. Oh, hi, Theodosia. There's somebody here. Yay. It's very lonely. This is the first time so far that nobody showed up right away. Now there's somebody here, so that's good. So central route persuasion, right? That's nice. That's good. And very often that's what you'll find like in an article about a political issue, right? The author will say, well, here's what I think ought to be done about the situation over there. Right? And then they provide reasons, right? And they provide reasoning. They explain the reasoning process. They try to show why this main claim is true. Right? To convince you that it's true, they provide reasons for believing it. And then you can just use your critical thinking skills to be able to evaluate that argument. Right? So there's nothing sneaky happening. Right? You're not being manipulated. You're just being provided evidence in favor of a claim, and then you can independently, with your own intelligence, assess whether or not that argument is right. And then this class is about how to do that, right? How do you evaluate arguments? When somebody does try to persuade you in that way, how do you think independently and critically about that argument that's been provided to you? The other way, the sneaky way, is peripheral route persuasion, right? That's where you influence people. You can use the word manipulate. Right? You can psychologically manipulate somebody to believe what you believe, right? Or to agree with you. Not through providing reasons to believe that this is true, right? But rather through some sort of tactic manipulation, right? So this becomes very easy, as we saw in chapter 2, with something like peer pressure, right? If you're part of a group already, and somebody in that group might want to persuade you that something is true, and that person could just say, hey, we all know this is true, right? I kind of appeal to popularity. You could say, well, we all think this, right? So don't you, the subtext is, you don't say this part out loud, but the subtext is, don't you want to be part of our group, right? If you do, you better agree with me. Right? Well, maybe you want to do that, but that has no bearing on whether or not that thing is true, right? Whether or not that thing is true has to do with evidence and reasons to believe, right? That's not evidence, right? That's the fact that an idea is popular. So we saw other examples of this as well in chapter 2, right? That there's ways in which we can pressure people to try to get them to agree with you, but that agreement isn't based on evidence or reasoning, right? It's just based on some sort of psychological tactic. So when we look at the notion of fallacies, we'll see some examples of this, right? Where people bring up irrelevant reasons that don't really have anything to do with the truth, but that sort of trick you, right? It tricks you into thinking that the person has a point or something like that. Another very easy way to do this, that we see this in politics all the time, is, say here is a political candidate, and here is their stance, and they are providing reasons, right? They're doing central route persuasion, right? Maybe that's rare these days that a politician does that, but let's just suppose here is a politician who is providing reasons for a stance, right? They think, I think free medical care for all, whatever the issue is, and then they provide reasons for it. Well, the political opponent could use peripheral route persuasion to manipulate people into not believing it, into just dismissing the argument without even looking at it, by, for example, attacking the person's character. Right? You could do what's called an ad hominem, right? So you could attack the person. Right? You could say, well, this person, they're an alcoholic, or they've divorced their wife, they've divorced 4 times or whatever. Right? Some sort of personal thing about the person that makes them look bad. Right? And then, by implication, it means that whatever that person is saying is wrong. But those two things are disconnected. Right? Someone's biography usually has no bearing on what they're saying, right? If they're addressing some sort of social issue, political issue, moral issue, whatever it may be, right? That claim should stand on fall according to the reasons provided for it. It has, in most cases, it's going to have nothing to do with the person presenting the argument. Right? So that's another way to do peripheral route persuasion is you focus on the person providing the argument instead of the argument itself. And this works, right? So if this happens in a public kind of a setting, you could get a whole bunch of people to dismiss a whole entire stance and a whole entire argument simply by making them think negatively about the person presenting the argument. Okay? So, anyway, we'll get back to other examples of peripheral route persuasion, but here we want to focus on those cases where people actually provide a real argument, right? How do we evaluate arguments? How do we think about it when someone says, here's what I think is true, and here are my reasons for it, right? There are objective standards that we can use to evaluate people's arguments. It isn't all just up in the air, right? Like we saw in chapter 2, this kind of radical subjectivism where there is no truth at all anymore. It's just what you personally believe. Well, no, we can actually do better than that. In critical thinking, right, we learn how to use objective standards to see whether or not an argument is good or not. Right? So if you're doing central route persuasion, right, the good way, then you take a stance on an issue and you provide reasons for thinking that that stance is right. Okay? When you do that, you're providing an argument. Now, I say stance, technically an argument happens anytime that you have statements that support another statement. So sometimes the arguments that we look at are not about some sort of important political stance or something like that, right? We could have a conclusion just being, I'm wearing a green shirt, right? And then I could provide an argument for that. Let's say, well, on Wednesday, I always wear a green shirt. Today is Wednesday. What follows logically? I am wearing a green shirt, right? So that's a silly example, but that still counts as an argument because I had a main claim that I'm wearing a green shirt, and then I backed it up with reasons, right? I always wear a green shirt on Wednesday. Today is Wednesday. Right? So that, it's kind of silly calling that a stance, right? But in important matters, we can call it a stance. Otherwise, we can just say that's the main claim I'm making, right? I'm making some sort of claim and I'm providing reasons for it. And so you can do that yourself, right? You can be the person presenting an argument. Then you want to do a good job at that, so be a good critical thinker, right? But you are also sometimes in a position of evaluating someone else's stance and their reasons, right? Then you are judging an argument, right, rather than providing one. The same skills are involved in both, right? Whether you're constructing your own argument or you're evaluating someone else's argument, the same things are going to apply. So here's an example that I used before, right? And just as a reminder, the examples that I use are neither here nor there. They're not things that I am saying, right? These are examples of arguments that someone might present. So it's not my mission here to convert people into veganism. I'm not even a vegan myself, okay? I think I should be because I actually kind of am convinced by these arguments. But anyway, that's autobiographical. That doesn't really matter. My whole point is that these examples that I use don't have a deeper meaning like I'm trying to convince you of it. They're all just toy examples, right? So someone might say, no one should eat meat if they have other sources of nutritious food. Now, if they just said that, there would be no argument. It would just be a claim. But if you're doing central route persuasion, then you provide reasons for your claim. And here a reason was provided, right? It's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering. And so the argument is sort of saying, well, if you agree that it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering, and then there's kind of an implicit or missing premise here, right? That, well, eating food, eating meats, for most of us here in the West, causes unnecessary suffering for the animals, right? So therefore, you shouldn't do it. It's an argument, right? Uh, they're providing you with reasons for believing the main claim. Is it a good argument? We're not concerned with that yet. This is only meant to be an example of an argument, right? Then eventually we'll learn how to think about these arguments and how to evaluate them. Right now, I'm just presenting examples of arguments. Sometimes you just reason to yourself, right? Sometimes you're not even thinking about persuading a bunch of people. You're just thinking to yourself, right? Almost every computer I've purchased at this specific online store has been a dud. There's been something wrong with it. So if I buy another thing from there, it's probably going to not be good either, right? I've provided reasons, right? I'm expecting something. I'm saying to myself, I expect the next computer, if I buy it from this store, I expect it to not work well or have something wrong with it. What are my reasons for that? Well, that's happened every time before, right? So I'm providing reasons for a claim. That's an argument. Oh, hi, Janice. Welcome back. I remember you were one of the few people that showed up before, so I'm glad to see you again. I used this example before as well. Good health depends on good nutrition, but good nutrition requires a sufficient income. So good health requires a sufficient income, right? Kind of see how you have two statements here, and then that third one just logically follows from those two first claims, right? And hopefully you remember the idea of a conclusion indicator and a premise indicator. Right? The word so is a conclusion indicator. It tells us that whatever comes next, that's the main thing that you're trying to prove, right? So this argument here is trying to prove that good health requires a sufficient income. The word so tells us that. It tells us this is the conclusion. This is the main thing, right? This is the stance that I'm taking. And then the other statements are reasons for the stance. Because banning assault rifles violates a constitutional right, the U.S. government should not ban assault rifles. Right? Again, this is an argument. It's all one sentence, but if you look at it closely, you'll see that it's composed of multiple statements. That often works like that. So this is an argument rather than a mere claim. If someone just said the U.S. government should not ban assault rifles, that's not an argument. That's simply making a claim. Very often people do that. Very often people will just confidently make a claim and then expect people to believe it. Right? Well, with central route persuasion, you actually provide reasons for believing the claim. And in this case, we have that, right? The person backed it up with some sort of evidence, right? Well, why should the U.S. government not ban assault rifles? Because it would violate a constitutional right, right? So, again, do you agree with the argument? Do you agree with the conclusion? Right now, that doesn't matter a whole lot. Right? What matters is that you understand what an argument is. Right? So here we have a main claim, a stance, and then a reason for believing it. Is it a good reason? Is the reason true? Right? These are all the kinds of questions we will ask eventually when we start evaluating arguments. But right now, you should just recognize what an argument is. Right, so the basic shape of it is that you have a main statement, and that statement is being supported by another statement or multiple other statements. That's basically what an argument is. Right, there's that statement, that's the main stance, the claim that's being argued for, the thing you're saying, here, everybody, this is what is true and you should believe. And then you provide other statements that provide reasons or evidence for that stance or that claim. For some people, my repeating things is going to drive you crazy, but I know from experience that many people need to hear the same thing over and over. It's amazing to me how sometimes people will be in a class like this, and halfway into it, they still don't understand the concept of an argument, right? So I'm just trying to avoid that. So if I'm too repetitive, I apologize for that, but it's for the people that need it, okay? So here's some technical vocabulary, right? Even the word argument is kind of a technical word here, because remember, an argument in critical thinking is not when you're fighting back and forth, having a verbal dispute, right? An argument is this kind of a structured thing, right? Where you have a conclusion, right? That's the main stance being taken, the main thing, that's what we call it, the conclusion. And then the statements that provide support are called premises. And so every argument is going to have one conclusion, just one, right? If there's multiple, well, then that's going to be a separate argument, right? So there's always going to be one statement that's the conclusion, and then one or more statements to support it, one or more premises. So those premises, then, they have a particular job. The job of a premise is to show that the conclusion is true, or at least likely to be true. Right? They provide evidence. So if we go back to this argument, no one should eat meat if they have other sources of nutritious food, since it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering. We can break that down, right? It's one single sentence, but it's not just a claim. It is an argument, because one of the claims is being supported by the other. So we can separate them and see that there's a structure to it, right? We have one premise: it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering. And then we have the conclusion that we should be able to infer, right? We're supposed to be making inference that, well, if it's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering, then it follows we shouldn't eat meat if there's other sources of nutritious food. Right? Of course, we'll get to this later, but some of you might have already noticed that there's kind of a missing link here, right? Because the way that people present arguments, sometimes they leave information out. That's the way people just naturally present arguments. As a good critical thinker, you always want to not leave anything out. But in this case, the thing that's left out is a second premise that says something like, eating meat when you have other sources of nutritious food causes unnecessary suffering, right? That's sort of the missing premise. We'll look at that kind of a thing later on, but just already be aware of it, because some of you might have spotted that already, right? That conclusion doesn't quite follow from just that single premise. There's kind of a background assumption here, background knowledge, right? That the idea is eating meats when there's other sources of nutrition easily available is going to cause suffering that's unnecessary, because you can get the nutrition some other way. Again, right now, we're not saying, is this a good argument? Right? Is this a bad argument? Are these reasons true? It's just getting familiar with the concept of an argument. We can look at this one, right? It's the same type of thing. We have two sentences, right? Just sentence, period. Right? Two sentences, but if you look closely, there's three statements being made. The word so there is a conclusion indicator, so that tells us that's a conclusion, right? Good health requires a sufficient income. That's the main stance, right? That's the main thing being argued for. That's called the conclusion. And then the other two statements support that conclusion, right? Statement one, good health depends on good nutrition. Statement two, good nutrition requires a sufficient income. If you take both of those statements, then you can infer the conclusion, right? The conclusion sort of drops right out of it. This is an example from the textbook. When Judy drives a car, she's always late. Well, she's driving a car now, so what do we expect, right? Some arguments you just know, right? People are primed for logical thinking. As long as the argument's pretty simple, I think any one of you could have inferred this conclusion, right? If it didn't say she will be late, you probably could have figured that out, right? If I had just said, hey, let's assume that it's true that whenever Judy drives her car, she's always late. And let's say that she is driving her car now. What follows logically? You probably would be able to figure out she's going to be late. Right? That's the idea of an inference being made. Right? So when you make an inference like that, you have premises that support the conclusion. Right? If both of these premises are true, it shows that the conclusion has to be true as well. All arguments work like that, right? You provide some premises, and then those premises show that the conclusion either has to be true logically, like in this case, or it's just highly likely based on the evidence. And that's what we'll learn about today as well. Those two different types of arguments are called deductive versus inductive. But we'll get to defining those terms in a little bit, but just to get you ready for it, right? Some arguments show that the conclusion has to be true if the premises are true, like this one right here, right? If it's really true that whenever Judy drives her car, she's always late, there's no exception to it, and there's never going to be an exception to it, right? If it's really absolutely true, and she is driving her car now, then you can logically infer, right? It has to be that Judy's going to be late. Right? If she wasn't, it would mean that the first premise was false, right? So it's, in this case, it's a logical inference that has to be true if the premises are true. Right? So I'm just ahead telling you that's a deductive argument. An inductive argument, if the premises are true, that the conclusion is just really likely to be true. And we'll all show you examples of all that. No one should buy beer brewed in Canada. Old Guzzler beer is brewed in Canada, so no one should buy it, right? This is one of the exercises that I could do. And people did get some people, not everybody, but some people got very confused and probably didn't watch the presentation. Some people got very confused about this, right? How to identify the premises and the conclusion, right? Well, the conclusion in this case is easy because we have, again, a conclusion indicator word, right? We have so. By the way, I see there are people here. Oh, Alani is here as well. Thank you. If this was a live class, it would be much more interactive, right? I'd be asking you questions. Sometimes I feel kind of bad with these things where I'm just talking and talking and talking. I wish there was more of a dynamic, right? It's just hard to do that in an online class. So tells us it's a conclusion. The conclusion is no one should buy it. Now, by the way, when you try to, when you kind of like lay out an argument systematically, you kind of want to just get rid of the word "it's" and say what it is that we're talking about, right? It is Old Guzzler beer, right? That's what the it is, right? So if I very nicely, right, reconstruct this argument in this very nice premise conclusion format, the conclusion is not going to say no one should buy its, because that's too vague, right? When we're doing critical thinking, we want everything to be explicit. We don't want to have to like refer back to some other thing that we said earlier. We want to lay it all out perfectly. So this way it has a nice logical flow to it, right? No one should buy beer brewed in Canada. Old Guzzler beer is brewed in Canada. So no one should buy Old Guzzler beer, right? That's the argument here. Those premises support the conclusion. And here's a great example of where we can see, that there's these two aspects that I referred to already in the first chapter, the truth question and the logic question, right? The truth question is, are these premises actually true? Well, no one should buy beer brewed in Canada. That's quite a claim to make, right? I think you could easily reject that claim, right? It seems to be kind of a personal opinion, unless you can provide a sub-argument. Sometimes you could do that, right? You can provide another argument for one of the premises. But in this case, I think as a critical thinker, you could easily reject premise number one, right? Is that really true, right? That you shouldn't buy beer brewed in Canada? That seems like kind of a ridiculous claim, right? So you could reject that, and therefore the argument fails because you don't agree with premise number one. So you presumably think the argument fails because it fails the truth question. Right? But the logic question, it actually does fine on, right? Because to ask the logic question, you say, well, what if the premises were true, right? Let me imagine a world where no one should ever buy beer brewed in Canada, and Old Guzzler beer is brewed in Canada. Well, then it would logically follow that no one should buy Old Guzzler beer, right? So there's a logical inference. It's perfectly logical, right? That conclusion follows from the premises. But that just means if the premises were to be true, would the conclusion also have to be true? The answer is yes. But an argument can't only pass the logic question, it has to also pass the truth question. Right? So in this case, even though the argument is logical, right, that's an inference that you can make from those premises, you could very easily say that the argument fails on the truth question because it has a very questionable premise. Premise number one is very questionable, right? We might also find out that Old Guzzler beer isn't even brewed in Canada, right? That's another way that it could fail the truth question. Maybe it's not brewed in Canada at all, right? So I'm just reminding you of the two main aspects of how to evaluate an argument. You ask, are these premises actually true? And then you also ask, if they were true, would the conclusion follow? Slightly more complex one, right? This is more of an example of really taking a stance on an issue, right? Some sort of social, some important issue, right? Because increasing atmospheric greenhouse gases contributes a lot to a rising global warming, human activity is contributing significantly to global warming, since burning fossil fuels increases atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. Well, that's a lot, right? That's a mouthful. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you deal with as a critical thinker in the real world. Right? That's why you need a class like this to be able to break it down into its component parts so you can really see the structure so that you can really evaluate it. So here we do have an argument. It's all crammed together into one sentence, right? But as you can see, right, a sentence can have many statements inside of it, right? So here we have a big sentence with three statements in it. And luckily, we have two premise indicators. Remember, we had conclusion indicators, word like so, therefore, thus, it follows that, right? Conclusion indicators tell us you're about to hear a conclusion. Right? Premise indicators tell us you're about to hear a premise. So common premise indicators are because and since. Those are probably the most common ones. So in this case, we can just look at those. We can see because increasing right? And since So whatever follows those two things, those are our premises. So then we can lay it all out like this, right? And this is a lot more manageable. When you, as a critical thinker, have to think about important global issues, right? Social issues, moral issues, whatever they may be. You're trying to think about whether this argument or this stance is correct. You're being a good critical thinker. It helps to lay it all out like this, right? So then we can have a premise number one: increasing atmospheric greenhouse gases contributes to global warming. Premise two: burning fossil fuels increases atmospheric greenhouse concentrations. And then the conclusion: human activity is contributing significantly to global warming, right? And then you can go ahead and ask those two questions, right? You can separate the logic question from the truth question. You can ask, is premise one true, right? Do I know this to be true? Is it likely to be true? Premise two, is that one true? Is that actually true that burning fossil fuels increases atmospheric greenhouse concentrations, right? And then once you've answered those, then you can ask the logic question. If both of the premises are true, does the conclusion logically follow, or does it at least follow inductively, as we'll look at later, right? If the premises are true, does that mean the conclusion is true or likely to be true? Right? That's the logic question. Uh, right? Just as a reminder before you set this, but premises support the conclusion. What does that mean? Support. It means they provide reasons to believe that the conclusion is true. So our technical definition of an argument, and I want you to have this down to the word, okay? I don't want variations on this. Just remember this definition. An argument is a conclusion supported by one or more premises. Okay? So the argument is the whole thing, the premises plus the conclusion. There's a way that you can read this where it makes it sound like the argument is a conclusion that happens to be supported by premises. No. An argument is premises plus conclusion, right? Like a formula. Premises plus conclusion equals argument. And again, as a reminder, conclusions and premises are statements, statements that can be true or false. So they're not questions like, what time is it? That's something that can't be true or false. And they're not commands like, close the door, right? Commands can't be true or false. And they also shouldn't be sentence fragments or incomplete sentences, right? It should be a full sentence that we can look at and think, does that correspond to reality? Is that true? Right? And I want to stress this because, again, people made certain mistakes when we did those exercises, when I had to identify the premises and the conclusions, even though we had gone over this, that premises and conclusions should be full sentences that are capable of being true or false. Right? So, right, in the original argument, it says, when Judy drives a car, she's always late. Since she is driving a car now, she will be late. It has the word since in the original argument. But if we said, since Judy is driving a car now, for premise number 2, that's not a complete sentence. Right? Think about that for a second. Just look at that. Since Judy is driving a car now. What? Since what? What? Then what? What? that doesn't say anything. It's an incomplete sentence. And an incomplete sentence cannot be a premise. You just leave the word since off, right? You don't need the word since when you reconstruct it, when you try to identify the premises and the conclusion, because those are just premise indicators. So you can leave those off, right? So this would have been wrong. Some people did it like this, right? Premise 1, when Judy drives a car, she's always late. And then premise 2, since Judy is driving a car now. Okay? And then conclusion, Judy will be late. No. That's wrong. You cannot do it that way. Each premise should be just a normal standalone statement on its own. This is a sentence fragment or an incomplete sentence. It's not true or false. And the fact is, we already said, hey, this is a premise, right? I actually like to number my premises. I like to go premise 1, premise 2. It already says this is a premise. So you don't need to say since again, right? Since just says this is a premise, right? We've already listed it as a premise. So if I were to ask as an exercise, right, take this argument, when Judy drives a car, she's always late. Since she is driving a car now, she will be late. You should understand, right, that premise 1 is whenever Judy drives a car, she's always late. Premise 2 is Judy is driving her car now, and then conclusion, Judy will be late. And then it has this nice logical flow to it, right? And as we've already seen, but it's important to stress this, a single sentence can have multiple statements inside of it. So we shouldn't confuse statements and sentences, right? You could have a sentence that has multiple statements in it. So even outside of arguments, you could look at this, right? This is not an argument, just a statement. I'm done with work, the sun is out, and I'm ready to party, right? That's one sentence, and it's one complex statement or compound statement, as they're called. But that whole complex statement is composed of multiple simple statements. Right? Statement 1, I'm done with work. Statement 2, the sun is out. Statement 3, I'm ready to party. Right? No argument here, right? Because we're not presenting reasons in favor of a conclusion. Maybe you could reconstruct it like that, but that's not the intention here. It doesn't say, therefore, I'm ready to party, right? It just says, and. So this just means it's a bunch of statements put together into one sentence. But here we have an example where it's a single sentence, but it's a whole argument, right? Because we have one statement supporting another one. Right? In red is one statement, in blue is another one, right? And notice that since is not really part of the statements. It just tells us what the relationship is between the red statement and the blue statement. That's why we leave it out. If I were to say, what's the conclusion here? It's just no one should eat meat if they have other sources of nutritious food. What's the premise? It's wrong to cause unnecessary suffering. The word since is just showing you what the relationship is between the red statement and the blue statement. Right? Since is a premise indicator. So this just tells us that the first statement is the conclusion, and the second statement, all in blue, is the premise that supports it. Right, and then this one, this doozy that I don't want to read the whole thing again, but it's one long sentence that we can break it up again, right, into each of these individual statements. So we have 3 individual statements, and then we have these premise indicators, because and since, that tell us which ones are the premises. And then we can rearrange the whole thing like this. And I hope it's clear, especially with that example, because that's the type of sentence you're likely to read if you're really engaging with the world, right, with social issues. If you are an activist in any aspect at all, right, if you want to make your voice heard, if you want to understand what's going on in the world and to be able to respond to it rationally, it helps to be able to look and to see a sentence like that and to sort of, almost like one of those, like what's that movie, A Perfect Mind, right, where you see all the equations in your mind, right? You should be able to take a sentence like that and just immediately in your mind, like, reconstruct it into this format where you go, oh, okay, premise 1 this, premise 2 this, and those are supposed to support the conclusion, right? And then you can right away start thinking, okay, well, is that premise true, right? You can go through it one thing at a time, rather than being so completely overwhelmed by this giant statement. You break it up into its component parts, and then you can go through it systematically. Right? You can ask, are the premises true? That's the truth question. And you can ask the logic question, do the premises actually support the conclusion? If the premises are true, does that mean that the conclusion is also true or likely to be true? Okay, I've teased this a little bit already, deductive versus inductive, right? I keep saying when we get to the logic question, we can ask, if the premises are true, does that mean that the conclusion has to be true or is likely to be true or is probably true, right? When it's the first one, if the premises are true and then the conclusion has to be true, that's deductive. If the premises being true means that the conclusion is probably true, that's inductive. Okay, but let's break that down. Right? Are the premises true? Is the evidence that's being presented factual? Right? Is this actually right? Oh, oh. That's going to be fun to correct. I always find not spelling mistakes is typos. I know how to spell accurate, but somehow just a cure. Okay, it's supposed to say accurate. I'm gonna have to go through and fix all that. Right? Uh, do we know if the reasons being provided, right, the premises, are they accurate? Are they factual? Are they probable? Right? And you might put them on a spectrum, right? Like how much confidence you have in the argument depends on how much confidence you have in the premises. Sometimes it doesn't work as absolutely as you want it, right? You want to be able to say, I know for a fact that this is false, or I know for a fact that this premise is true. Sometimes you have to make some more of a kind of a relative judgment, but you can still proportion your confidence in the argument to how well supported or how well that premise is known to be true or probable or likely, etc. Right? You're basically asking, can I trust this evidence? Right? And then the logic question is separate from that, right? The logic question is, what logical inference can we make from the premises? What can we infer, right? If the premises are true, what else can I judge to be true on the basis of that? And for that, you don't actually have to know the answer to the truth question, right? So if someone presents you with an argument and it has premises and you don't know if those premises are true or false, well, you can just at least look at the logic question, right? Because the logic question is separate from that. For the logic question, you don't have to know if the premises are actually true or false. All you have to do is, let me imagine a world where these premises are true. In that world, would that conclusion also have to be true or be likely to be true? Right? So for that, you don't have to know, are they actually correct? Right? You just have to know if they were, what would logically have to follow? Looks like my computer is not plugged in. Hold on. Wouldn't want my computer to just suddenly die. Okay, good. Just caught that right in the nick of time. Now, if this is not entirely clear yet, I will give you examples to look at later on, okay? But I just want you to be able to separate the two questions, right? We do care, are the premises true or not? That's very important, right? But we can separate that from the logical question of, does this conclusion follow from the premises? Right? Or if the premises are true, would the conclusion have to be true? Or if the premises were true, would the conclusion be likely to be true? Right? That tells us the difference between deductive and inductive. But still haven't gotten there yet, right? So here, this is a classic example of an argument where if the premises are true, right, the conclusion has to be true, right? So even if you don't know who Socrates is, and maybe you're not certain that all humans are mortal, right? Maybe you have doubts about the premises. You could still see that the logic here works. That if these premises were to be true, that conclusion would have to be true. Right? It would be logically impossible for Socrates to be immortal if Socrates is human and humans are always mortal. Right? I hope you see that, right? That the logic question can be addressed and answered, even if we don't know the truth of the premises. In this case, I mean, I think the premises are true, so it's fine by me. But again, we're not quite as concerned with really evaluating arguments, right? I'm just sort of showing you how it's done. And so the logic question would be, if the premises were true, would the conclusion have to be true as well, or probably true? In this case, it's one of these ones where it has to be true. Logically, it just has to be true that Socrates is mortal if those premises are both true. That is an if, of course, right? But that's why you can separate truth from logic. The answer to the logic question is a definite yes, right? So even if you think some humans are immortal, right, the logic part still checks out. Of course, if you know that humans are not all mortal, then you can reject the argument. But you reject it because of the truth question, not because of the logic question. And by the way, this is something also, not only do you have to think about these two questions to be a good critical thinker, it's also a good way to build good faith with the person that you are arguing with, because it allows you to say, if you really disagree with someone and you think they're totally wrong, but you're having a back and forth discussion, and you want to be respectful, right? And you want to sort of show good faith. You could say something like, well, I see the logic of your argument. I see how the conclusion follows from those premises. But, I don't think I agree with this premise right here. Right? Here's some evidence that I have that shows this premise is not true. Right? That way you're being respectful and you're saying something positive about the other person, about their side, but without having to accept the whole thing. Or you could also do it the other way. You could say, well, I see all the evidence that you're providing is true. I agree with this premise. I agree with this premise. I agree with this premise. But I don't see how the conclusion follows from those premises. I could see all those premises being true and yet the conclusion being false. So just keep that in mind, right? If you're ever arguing with someone, it's kind of nice, right, to point out where the argument doesn't fail, right? So if you think the argument fails, it's going to be because of truth or logic. But if it doesn't fail in one of those aspects, then it's nice to point that out. Here's another example, right? All humans are mammals. Fido is a mammal. Therefore, Fido is a human. Now, I hope some alarm bells are going off in your mind. Yes, let those alarm bells ring. We'll get to them. First, let's just ask, are the premises true? Well, all humans are mammals. That is true. Fido is a mammal. Well, we don't know the context, right? Let's suppose this is a friend of yours that has a dog, and the dog's name is Fido. Fido is a mammal. All humans are mammals. Okay. Both of the premises are true. You say, yes, it passes the truth question test. But what about the logic question, right? If those premises are true, does that conclusion logically follow? No, right? It fails in that respect. The answer to the logic question is no, right? Even if it's true that all humans are mammals and Fido is a mammal, it does not follow logically that Fido is a human. Right? Again, even the way that I set it up, right? Fido could be a dog. Fido could be a cat. Fido could be any non-human mammal. So even if it's true that all humans are mammals, and that is true, and even if it's true that Fido is a mammal, let's say it is true, it does not follow logically at all that Fido is a human. Right? It simply doesn't. So even though it looks like one of these nice arguments, right? It kind of looks like, there you go, kind of looks like this, right? It has that feel, right? That, oh, if these premises are true, then this third thing has to be true. In this case, yes. But if you think carefully about this example, you'll realize the conclusion does not follow logically from the premises, right? Fido doesn't have to be a human. Both of the premises could be true, but we could find out that Fido is a cat or a dog. Whereas with the previous one, if all humans are mortal and Socrates is a human, we can't find out that Socrates is immortal. It just wouldn't make any sense, right? If both of those premises are true, right? If we're saying, let's suppose, right? Let's imagine a world where all humans are truly mortal and Socrates is one of those humans. Well, then it follows that Socrates is mortal. If Socrates were to be immortal, it means that one of the premises would have had to have been false. So in this case, if the premises are true, the conclusion logically couldn't be any different. It could not say Socrates is not mortal. That would not make any sense. Whereas here, the conclusion might as well be Phaedo is not a human, right? We just don't know on the basis of those two premises. Those premises do not allow us to draw an inference. If all we know is all humans are mammals and Phaedo is a mammal, nothing follows logically from that. But notice that, right? You could switch things around slightly. You see the difference? Some people start to tune out here, but this is the logic part of it, right? Where a small difference can make all the difference in the world, right? I hope you can see here, all humans are mammals, Phaedo's a mammal. It does not follow that Phaedo is a human, right? But if we change things, if we say all humans are mammals, Phaedo is a human, if both of those statements are true, right? Let's imagine a world where all humans are mammals, and let's imagine that in that world, Phaedo is one of those humans. Then it would have to follow, just like it did for Socrates being mortal, right, that Phaedo is a mammal. So sometimes it's like that. Sometimes you switch one word around, and suddenly it passes the logic question. Right? So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Let's go back to this classic. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Socrates is mortal. I hope everyone can sort of see this, at least with this example, that the conclusion has to be true if both of the premises are true. And that's what makes it a deductive argument. That's what defines deductive versus inductive. And in this whole class, we're only going to talk about 3 types of arguments. Most of them will be deductive and inductive. Okay? The final one will be abductive, but we don't have to worry about that yet. Here, just try to think of this distinction. Deductive versus inductive. For the deductive argument, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Right? It guarantees that Socrates is mortal if humans are mortal and Socrates is human. Right? Another way to say that is to say that the conclusion follows logically or deductively from the premises. The conclusion couldn't possibly be false if the premises are true. Okay, there's another typo. Should say conclusion. Philosophers use what's called modal language sometimes to talk about these things. Right? Philosophers, instead of saying it's possible, it's not possible, philosophers will talk about possible worlds and impossible worlds, right? So there's no possible world where Socrates is human, humans are mortal, but Socrates isn't mortal. Right? There's no possible world like that because that would involve a contradiction, and contradictions can't be true. If Socrates were to be not mortal, then one of the other statements would have to be true, would have to be false, right? Then that would mean that Socrates maybe isn't a human, maybe he's a god, right? Or maybe not all humans are mortal, right? One of the premises would have to be false in order for Socrates to be not mortal. But if the premises are both true, then it's just not possible for Socrates to be not mortal. And we'll bring back this language of possible worlds later when we do logic, right? Because this kind of tells us the definition of a good deductive argument, right? For a good deductive argument, if the premises are true, right, then there's no possible world where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So this means deductive arguments try to give you definitive proof for the conclusion. Right? The conclusion just has to be true if the premises are true. It's still contingent on the truth of the premises, of course, right? Ultimately, for the argument to be successful, it has to pass not just the logic question, but also the truth question. So here we have a beautiful, logical, deductive argument where the conclusion follows logically from the premises, But, if you find out that not all humans are mortal, then this argument fails. This example from earlier also falls in this deductive category, right? When Judy drives a car, she's always late. Judy's driving a car now. It follows logically that Judy will be late. If both of the premises are true, the conclusion's got to be true. And it's an example, right, where, this argument, I'm presenting it out of context. We don't know who Judy is, right? We don't know if it's true that when she drives her car, she's always late, right? We don't know if the premises are true or not. We just don't. But we could still see that the inference is logical, right? We can ask and answer the logic question, right? Because again, all you have to do is imagine that the premises are true. Could the conclusion even possibly be false? Well, no. If Judy is driving a car now, and whenever she drives a car, she's late, then it couldn't possibly be false that Judy will be late. Judy has to be late if both of those premises are true. But again, it's if, right? So we can imagine a world where the premises are true and then ask, would the conclusion have to be true? Then we can ask and answer the logic question without knowing the answer to the truth question. Right? But again, I have to stress this, for an argument to be successful, right? That's the whole thing, is you as a critical thinker, you're trying to figure out, is this a good argument? A good argument passes both of the tests. It's not enough for an argument to be logical, right? The premises have to actually be true. Right? So I've used this example before, and I'll use it again, right? If I'm a wizard, then I know how to do magic. I am a wizard, therefore I know how to do magic. There, we know one of those premises is false. Well, I can tell you anyway. Maybe you suspected I might be a wizard, but I'm telling you I'm not, right? So that premise, I am a wizard, is false. But the argument is logical, right? The inference is right. If it were to be true that all wizards know magic and I am a wizard, then it would follow logically that I know magic. But the argument fails because I'm not a wizard, right? It's one of the situations where you could say, well, Tim, your argument is logical, right? It's deductively correct, but it's based on a false premise, right? So if your argument is completely logical, but it's based on a false assumption or a false premise, then the argument still fails. But if the argument passes both, right, then you should accept the conclusion, or you're just being irrational, right? So if you see an argument and you agree with the premises and you think that the premises support the conclusion, then you should change your mind. You should believe the conclusion, right? Or you're being irrational about something, right? Or you have to go back and judge, like, are the premises actually really true, right? Do they really support the conclusion? But if you find that the premises support the conclusion and the premises are true, then you should believe the conclusion. Okay, I'm going to try to hurry and be done pretty soon. Just another example, right? A philosophy example. Philosophy is full of arguments, and most people don't lay out an argument like this, right? That's why I showed you arguments like all smushed together into one sentence. Most people don't present their arguments in this way. Philosophers sometimes do. So here's a nice little deductive argument where if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, right? So this is a great test case. If you find yourself agreeing with both of the premises, you better agree with the conclusion, right? If all events are determined by the past, then we have no free will. All events are determined by the past, therefore we have no free will, right? If you agree with both of the premises, then you should agree with that conclusion because it logically follows. Now, of course, the whole big question is premise number one true, right? If events are determined by the past and we have no free will. Is that true? Well, some philosophers defend a definition of free will where that premise is not true. Right? Or all events are determined by the past. Well, you might look at certain quantum phenomena where the outcome is not completely deterministic. Right? So there's ways to question this argument, but it would have to be from the truth question point of view, because in this case, I made sure that this argument format passes the logic question. If both of the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true. So if you disagree with the conclusion here, you must somehow disagree with one of the premises. But I could also present a flip side of this argument, right? This is the fun thing about philosophy and logic. You can kind of see how this works, because I could have done it like this. Same first premise, all events are determined by the past, then we have no free will. But premise 2 says, but we all know we have free will, right? We do have free will. So therefore, I can conclude that not all events are determined by the past. So this shows you these are toy examples for you to think about, right? All I can tell you is for both of these, the logic question checks out, right? The conclusion follows logically from the premises. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So these are both deductive arguments that have that logical flow that we're looking for. The big question just is, are the premises actually true, right? Or which premises are more likely to be true, etc. Going back to this one. That's the big difference between deductive and inductive, right? That in deductive arguments, if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. It's gotta be true. 100% has to be true, right? But contrast that with this argument. And inductive arguments or inductive reasoning might be more common than deductive. It's just a little trickier, but a lot of our everyday decision making is actually based on inductive reasoning, not deductive. So here's an inductive argument, very similar to the Socrates one from earlier, right? But here it says most ancient Greeks wore togas. Does everyone know what togas are? No, I don't know how else to describe them, but to go like this, right? Kind of a robe thing, right? Most ancient Greeks wore togas. Socrates, well, is an ancient Greek. Well, so, Socrates probably wore a toga. But notice, I couldn't even just say Socrates wore a toga. I had to put probably in there, right? That's the big difference. It could be true that most ancient Greeks wore togas, and because Socrates was an ancient Greek, then it's very likely that he also wore a toga. That's a very good guess, and that's more probable than not. So it makes sense to believe that Socrates wore togas on the basis of this evidence. It's reasonable to believe that. But there's a possibility that even if both of the premises are true, that the conclusion is not true. It's possible, right? Even though it's very unlikely, it's still possible. And that's different from deductive. With the deductive arguments, if the premises are true, the conclusion is unavoidable. It's got to be true. With a good inductive argument like this, the fact that the premises are true just shows that the conclusion is probably true and more likely than the opposite. Because here's the thing. There's a near contemporary of Socrates, Diogenes, the cynic. There's actually the word cynic actually comes from the word cynic comes from a different thing, but his nickname was Diogenes the dog. Right? Diogenes sort of was an early version of somebody who just lives outside of society's conventions. Right? Diogenes questioned everything. He questioned the society around him, all the social norms. He questioned those. He was kind of a weird guy. And part of his thing was to get back to nature, to be a natural being, right? To be an animal, basically. He thought that, we, with all this intelligence that we have, we build up all these societies and it's all artificial. He wanted to get back to nature and get back to just your basic state. And as part of that, he would just not wear clothes, right? So most ancient Greeks wore togas. Diogenes was an ancient Greek. well, then it kind of follows that probably he wore a toga. But it turns out he didn't, right? So the conclusion could be false, even if the premises are true. Almost every computer I've purchased at this online store has been a dud. Therefore, the next computer I purchase at the same online store will also likely be a dud. Right? You hear the word likely, right? And that tips you off that this is an inductive argument. Because again, even if I've bought 10 computers from this store all in a row, and each of them has been really bad, okay, then it makes sense. It's reasonable of me to expect the next one to be bad as well. But it's still logically possible that maybe this time it'll be a good one. Be a very low likelihood, right? It's very likely that it'll be a bad one. But all we can say is that it's highly likely. With deductive arguments, it's not like that. If the premises of a deductive argument are true, then the conclusion 100% has to be true. Here, it's more like 95, 99% chance has to be true. There's always this, even in the best inductive argument, there's always a sliver of a possibility that the conclusion is wrong, even if the premises are true. This medication works for 95% of people with the same symptoms as me, so it should work for me, right? Yeah, that's a reasonable expectation, right? You're going to be pretty hopeful that this medication works for you. But in the back of your mind, you know, of course, well, there's 5% of people for whom this doesn't work. Maybe I'm part of the 5%. It's not very likely, but it's certainly possible. Notice for some of these, I set them up just as the way that people might in real life just blurt something out or write something where it's not labeled premise, conclusion. And sometimes I label it, right? Because I kind of want you to be able to go back and forth, right? From normal everyday English to, how would you think about this as a critical thinker, right? You have the beautiful mind thing going on where you can take that sentence that someone said and take it apart and put it into this structure, premises and a conclusion, right? Okay, so in this case, I did that, right? Premise one, I usually get tired around 2 p.m. on a work day. It's a work day today. Well, what can I expect? I'm going to get tired at 2 today, right? But could be the case that today's different, right? Even if I usually get tired around 2 on a work day, and even if it is a work day, right? Even if both of those things are true, right? I imagine myself in that universe where both of those things are true. Is it still possible that maybe today I won't get tired? Yeah, totally, right? Maybe I decide to drink a bunch of caffeine, or maybe I'm just, for whatever other reason, I'm not as tired today. That's totally possible, right? It's still a good guess, right? If almost every single day on your work day, your normal work day, you get kind of tired around 2, you get this crash or whatever, right? Then, you can expect that that's going to keep happening. But it won't blow your mind if it doesn't happen one day, right? Just because the premises are true, it doesn't mean that that conclusion has to be true. It just makes it likely or probable. Another way to talk about this is guarantee, right? In a good deductive argument, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In an inductive argument, the truth of the premises just strongly supports the conclusion. It shows that the conclusion is probably going to be true, right? Most likely. You can bet on it, that sort of a thing. It's all about a high likelihood. Oh, pretty close to being done here. Okay. So for an overall successful deductive argument, right, we wanted to pass the truth test and the logic test, right? So the truth test would mean the premises are true, and the logic test would be, well, that logically makes the conclusion have to be true. It guarantees the truth of the conclusion, right? So that's what we're looking at overall, right? So if you're looking at an argument, try to determine, is this a deductive argument or an inductive argument? Okay, so if it's a deductive argument, you ask the same two questions either way, but you ask, are the premises true? And if the premises are true, what does that mean for the conclusion? Does it logically guarantee the conclusion to be true? That would be a successful deductive argument, right? If it can pass both the truth test and the logic test, right? The form, the content question, and the form question. Sometimes, yeah, you don't have to worry about form versus content, but that's one way to say it as well, right? The form question is the logic question. The content question is the truth question. For a successful inductive argument, we always need the premises to be true. For any type of argument, your beginning information that you're drawing inferences from, they should always be correct, right? So we're going to say the same thing. The premises are true, but in an inductive argument, that just makes the conclusion highly, highly, highly likely to be true. And in many cases, it might even be like just 99.999, right? So I used this example last time. If I'm about to cross the street and I don't see any cars, it's logically maybe possible that, they have some secret technology that can cloak a whole car and make it invisible. Right? And so maybe I'm going to get hit by the invisible car. But that's so unlikely, right? So I can inductively infer, there's not going to be any invisible cars, even if I can't completely guarantee that outcome. It's reliable, right? So far, I've never gotten hit by an invisible car. So it's totally legitimate to use inductive reasoning is what I'm trying to say. I don't want to make it sound like inductive is somehow less than deductive, right? Most of the time, it just means that there's a logical possibility of the conclusion being false if the premises are true. But that doesn't mean it's a high probability or anything like that, right? So we can lay them right besides each other to really see the difference, right? Deductive, all humans are mortal. Socrates is human. What then? Has to be true. Absolutely 100% must be true. Socrates is mortal. Has to be true if both of the premises are true. For the inductive one, most ancient Greeks wore togas. Socrates was an ancient Greek. Therefore, Socrates wore a toga. It's also a good argument, right? Both of these arguments are good. But in the inductive case, there is a small possibility that maybe the conclusion will turn out to be false, even if both of the premises are true. Okay, so now, almost done here. I keep saying that, but it really is almost done. There's a couple of vocabulary terms, and you should get used to these terms, okay? Especially the deductive stuff. The inductive stuff we're going to come back to later. We're going to focus on the next few weeks on deductive reasoning. So really get the deductive terminology in your mind. So this one especially. What do we call that when a deductive argument passes the logic question? What is the logic question? Well, if the premises are true, does that show that the conclusion must be true, right? That the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed by the truth of the conclusion. If it is, then we call it valid, right? So we can say it's a valid argument. So forget about what valid means in everyday situations, right? How you use the word valid is not relevant here. Valid means something very specific here, right? A deductive argument is valid if the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. If it fails, then we just call it invalid, right? And let's be clear about this. A failed deductive argument does not turn into an inductive argument, right? That maybe is a little bit tricky, but to know that it's deductive, you have to look at the format of the argument, right? What kind of an argument is this? What is this person trying to say? Are they trying to present a deductive argument, or are they trying to present an inductive argument, right? Okay, so a deductive argument can go wrong, right? We saw the Fido example, right? You can present something that looks logical, that looks like a deductive argument, but if you think about it, especially once you learn how to use logic, right, we can actually prove it. An argument that looks good and logical might actually be invalid, right? That the conclusion is actually not guaranteed by the truth of the premises. And next time we'll look at examples of this, right? So we can, I really believe in having examples, and maybe I have too many examples, but I think that's the best way to see, to know these kind of abstract truths, is to see it in action, right? So I'll give you examples of all this as we go along. Right now, I'm just sort of introducing it, right? When an inductive argument passes the logic question, right? So for an inductive argument, that would mean if the premises are true, does that mean that the conclusion is highly likely or probably true? Then we call it strong, right? We say it's a strong inductive argument. Sort of, you can think of the analogy of a murder case, right? So let's say Jones is the defendant, right? They think Jones killed somebody, right? And then they present evidence for it, right? So if you just present one piece of evidence, that's kind of a weak argument, right? If you just show, well, Jones had a motive. Well, maybe lots of people had motives. It's evidence, but it's a weak case. But if you show that Jones had a motive, he was seen at the scene of the crime, his fingerprints were on the weapon, you're building your case so that if all that evidence is correct, then it's starting to look more and more likely that Jones is the murderer, right? You're making your argument stronger by adding more to it, right? And that makes the conclusion more and more likely to be true. And if you only have a little bit of evidence, right, then it's a weak argument. So for inductive arguments, there's a continuum, right? Very weak arguments, moderate to strong, very strong, right? And there's no exact way to determine where, right? That's what makes inductive arguments a little bit tricky. With deductive arguments, it's binary. It's either valid or invalid, right? That's it. Inductive arguments, it's a matter of degree, right? And it kind of depends on the context. How high do you need that probability to be for you to accept it as truth, for you to accept it as something reliable that you can act on? That kind of depends on the argument and the context. Okay, so for deductive arguments, it's either going to be invalid or valid. The conclusion will follow logically or it won't. Black and white, right? Inductive, these premises can support the conclusion a little bit. Then it's a weak argument, and you should reject weak arguments, right? But you build it and make it into a strong argument, right? Then if it's strong enough, at some point you say, okay, I accept that conclusion, right? So, the Socrates arguments, I don't think there's anything on the books about Socrates ever not wearing a toga. You would think that Plato, who wrote all about Socrates, would have said something about him if he did walk around naked like Diogenes, right? So, Socrates wore a toga. That's historically reliable. That's a historically reliable idea. We can trust that idea, even though we can't completely rule it out. Right? It's high probability. So that's a pretty strong argument. Since almost all the ancient Greeks wore togas, right, then if that's true anyway, right? We're talking about whether it passes the logic tests, right? And Socrates was an ancient Greek, right? Then it's just highly likely that Socrates did wear a toga. But it's, there's always room for error when it's an inductive argument. So weak versus strong, but it's not binary, right? It's a whole spectrum, a whole range, right? Okay, so that's technical vocabulary so far that has to do with the logic question, right? A good deductive argument is valid. A bad deductive argument is invalid. But that only has to do with the logic question. What if it passes the logic question and the truth question, right? If we have a deductive argument that has true premises and it passes the logic question, right, and it's valid, then we call it sound. So sound is the golden standard for deductive arguments. If a deductive argument is sound, it means that the premises are true, and the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So by definition, sound arguments have true conclusions, right? Because sound arguments, in order to be sound, have to pass both of the tests. The premises are true, and the premises being true means that the conclusion must be true, logically speaking, right? So with a sound argument, you're logically guaranteed that the argument is going to present you with a true conclusion, right? So long as it truly is based on true premises. So a valid deductive argument with true premises is called sound. And that's what it's aiming for, right? If it's not sound in any way, we'll look at this more later next time, then we're going to reject it, right? And then finally, when an inductive argument passes both the logic tests and the truth tests, we call it cogent, right? So if you have a strong inductive argument with true premises, we call it cogent, right? So a deductive argument should always be sound for it to be convincing, and an inductive argument should be cogent for it to be convincing. In both cases, we need the premises to be true, right? In the deductive case, we need the argument to be valid, and in the inductive case, we need the argument to be strong. Okay, we'll end here. This is your class exercise, your first one for this week. Once I have this slideshow completed, I'll put it on the Prezi as well. But for now, you'll just have to go off of this. So, if you're watching the video, you don't have to go back to it later. You can also just snap a picture of this right now, right? Or take a screenshot or something like that, so that you have it available. Because this is not going to match 3.1 in the book, right? This is my own numbering that I did here. So for each of these arguments are going to be either deductive or inductive, right? And what I want you to do is forget about the conclusion for this one. Just identify the premise or the premises. Okay? What are the premises of each of the arguments, and then state whether it's deductive or inductive. And when you state each of these premises, make sure that it's a complete sentence, right? And don't leave those premise indicators in there, right? So for the first one, for example, it says, since every mammal is warm-blooded and whales are mammals, whales are warm-blooded. For premise number one, you don't want to say, since every mammal is warm-blooded. No. For premise number one, you want to say, every mammal is warm-blooded. Right? You leave since out of it so that it can be a complete true-false statement. Okay? So that's all you have to do. Write down what the premises are, right? And yeah, if there's multiple premises, go ahead and say premise number one, like I do, premise number two, right? And then state what each of the premises is, okay? You don't have to identify the conclusion for this one. But do tell me, is this an inductive argument or a deductive argument? Okay, Janice or Theodosia, do you have any questions before I sign out? No? Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming.